January 1943. High above the frozen fields of northern Europe, the sky looks empty, clean, silent, deceptively calm. American bombers climb in slow, grinding spirals, engines straining as the air thins. Inside the aircraft, men sit shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in fleece and leather, oxygen masks hissing softly. Frost creeps along metal frames, fingers stiffen around gun handles. Below them, the continent is hidden by cloud, but everyone knows what waits there. The doctrine is clear. Fly higher, fly tighter. Trust the formation. These bombers were designed to defend themselves. Bristling with guns, flying fortresses, the planners called them. If they stayed together, no fighter could break through. Mathematics, engineering, and American confidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Daylight bombing was survivable. Then the sky begins to move. Tiny specks rise from the horizon, climbing faster than seems possible. They grow larger with terrifying speed, not behind the bombers where the guns are strongest but straight ahead, where closing speeds turn seconds into eternity. In that moment, theory gives way to instinct. The sky is no longer empty. It is hunting them. And this is where the story truly begins. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it brought with it a belief that bordered on faith. Not faith in luck, or even in courage, but in systems. American air power had been built around an idea refined long before the first bombs fell on Europe. Wars could be shortened, even won, by striking an enemy's industrial heart directly from the air. This belief was not abstract. It had been debated, tested, and institutionalized in U.S. air schools throughout the interwar years. Strategic bombing theory argued that factories, rail hubs, oil refineries, and aircraft plants were the true nervous system of modern war. Destroy them, and armies would collapse without the need for endless ground battles. By 1942, this idea hardened into doctrine. The United States Army, Air Forces United States Army, Air Forces committed itself to daylight precision bombing. Unlike Britain, which had shifted toward night bombing after catastrophic losses, American planners believed accuracy required visibility. Bombs dropped in daylight could hit specific targets. And with the right aircraft, they believed those missions could be survived. The aircraft chosen for this role was the heavy bomber. Machines like the B-17 and B-24 were designed to fly high, carry large bomb loads, and defend themselves with multiple gun positions. Engineers and tacticians believed overlapping fields of fire, dozens of machine guns covering every angle, would make fighter interception prohibitively costly for the enemy. There was also confidence in altitude. American bombers operated higher than most enemy fighters had during the early years of the war. Thin air reduced engine performance, slowed reactions, and punished pilots physically. The assumption was simple. The higher the bombers flew, the safer they would be. Combined with tight box formations, this altitude advantage was expected to form an airborne fortress that no fighter force could penetrate. But this confidence rested on a fragile assumption, one shaped more by theory than experience over Europe. By the time American bombers began regular operations over occupied territory in 1942, Germany had already been fighting an air war for years. The skies over Europe were not empty laboratories. They were battlefields shaped by attrition, adaptation, and brutal learning curves. Germany's air arm, the Luftwaffe, had survived the Battle of Britain, fought over the Soviet Union, and refined interception tactics against real opponents. Its pilots were not encountering bombers for the first time. They were veterans operating within a dense, layered defense system. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming formations early. Ground controllers tracked bomber streams and directed fighters with precision. Anti-aircraft batteries flak-forced bombers to hold steady courses, turning formations into predictable targets. And yet, early American missions showed encouraging results. Initial raids met limited resistance. Losses were painful, but not catastrophic. Bombers returned with damage, crews shaken but alive. Each successful mission reinforced the belief that the doctrine worked. that the numbers would hold, that the sky could be mastered through discipline and design. What planners underestimated was not German courage or German technology but German adaptation, because while American doctrine assumed fighters would attack from behind or below, German pilots were studying the bombers just as closely, measuring blind spots, calculating closing speeds, testing angles where even dozens of guns could not react in time. And slowly, deliberately, the enemy began to rewrite the rules of the sky. The stage was set not for a single battle, but for a collision between belief and reality that would only reveal itself once the losses began to mount. By 1942, the air war over Europe had already stripped away illusions from those who had fought it. The German side understood something the Americans were only beginning to learn. Air combat was not static. It was evolutionary. Every tactic invited a counter. Every advantage created a vulnerability somewhere else. The Luftwaffe no longer relied on chance encounters or lone interceptions. Germany's air defense system had become an integrated machine. Radar stations provided early warning. Plotting rooms tracked bomber formations in real time. Fighters were scrambled with altitude, direction, and timing already calculated before the enemy ever crossed the coast. This mattered because American bombers were not fast. Fully loaded, they climbed slowly. Once committed to a bombing run, they had limited freedom to maneuver. Bombardiers required straight and level flight to aim accurately. That nécessité précise made evasion impossible at the most dangerous moment of the mission. German pilots noticed this immediately. They also noticed something else. The bomber formations were strongest where American planners expected attacks and weakest where no one thought to look. Rear gunners were alert. Tail defenses were dense. Attacks from below had risks, but they were anticipated. What went largely untested in American exercises were high-speed frontal assaults. Head-on attacks compressed reaction time 2 seconds. Guns designed to track slower targets struggled against closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. German fighters began approaching from directly ahead, firing in brief, violent passes, then breaking away before defensive fire could concentrate. The tactic reduced exposure time and exploited human limit reaction speed, visibility, and coordination under stress. Losses began to rise. At first, they were explained away. Weather, bad luck, isolated heavy resistance, but the numbers kept climbing, and patterns emerged. Aircraft damaged beyond repair. Crews lost not deep inside Germany but at the edges, where fighters had fuel and time to strike repeatedly. There was another problem American doctrine had postponed confronting escort fighters. Early American fighters lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory. They could protect formations near the coast, but beyond that, bombers flew alone. Once escorts turned back, the bombers entered airspace fully controlled by the enemy. This gap was not accidental, it was accepted. Planners believed escort fighters were unnecessary. The bombers would defend themselves. Adding escorts would complicate missions, strain logistics, and dilute the purity of the daylight bombing concept. The theory was elegant. Reality was not. As missions pushed farther inland, German defenders adjusted. Fighters no longer attacked once and disengaged. They waited. They reformed. They attacked again and again, exploiting the bombers' need to maintain formation and altitude. Inside the aircraft, the psychological toll was immense. Crews flew through flak bursts that shook metal frames and shredded skin. They watched neighboring aircraft drift out of formation trailing smoke. Parachutes blossomed or didn't. Each hole punched into a fuselage was proof that the fortress could be breached. Yet the missions continued. Factories had to be hit. Production had to be disrupted. Every raid was justified by strategic necessity. Every loss was weighed against future advantage, and every successful bombing reinforced the belief that endurance would carry the day. What no one could yet quantify was the breaking point. How many crews could be trained fast enough to replace losses? How many aircraft could be built before attrition erased progress? How long could men climb into freezing skies, knowing the odds were steadily worsening? By late 1942 and early 1943, American air power stood at a crossroads it did not yet recognize. Doctrine demanded persistence. Experience demanded change. Between those two forces, The sky was becoming deadlier by the week. The next phase of the story would not be decided in planning rooms but in the violent convergence of bombers and fighters, where theory would finally be tested to destruction. For the men inside the bombers, the war was experienced in fragments, noise, cold, vibration, and waiting. Missions could last 8 hours or more, most of it spent climbing and cruising, knowing the danger would arrive suddenly and without warning. Crewmen were specialists, each bound to a narrow task. Pilots held formation with obsessive discipline. Navigators recalculated headings as winds shifted. Gunners scanned to empty sky until it wasn't empty anymore. There was no room for heroics. If one gunner froze or misjudged speed, an opening appeared. And yet, fear was constant. Every man understood that individual mistakes could ripple outward, endangering dozens of others. At high altitude, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Wounds were harder to treat. Missions stacked upon missions. The sky never grew familiar. Each flight carried the memory of previous losses, empty bunks and barracks, and faces that would not return. American planners trusted machines to compensate for human limits. Bombers were engineered to absorb damage. Redundant systems, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. Each feature was designed to keep aircraft airborne, even after being hit. Guns covered the tail, waist, nose, and belly. Overlapping arcs were calculated precisely. In theory, any fighter entering range would face a storm of bullets before it could inflict meaningful damage. But machines obey physics, not doctrine. Guns had traverse limits. Turrets had blind spots. Ammunition ran out. At extreme closing speeds, even perfectly aimed fire could miss. The technology designed to protect bombers revealed its constraints. Altitude, once seen as a shield, became a burden. Engines struggled. Ice formed quickly. Crews worked slower. Reaction times lengthened just enough for enemy fighters to exploit. Predictable and bound by rules the defenders did not share. Bombers could not scatter. Every one of those requirements simplified interception. German pilots learned to read formations like maps. They identified weak aircraft, those lagging slightly behind, already damaged, or flown by less experienced crews. They coordinated attacks to overwhelm specific sections, forcing defensive guns to divide attention. Most importantly, they treated each mission as data. From below, from ahead, from angles no planner had anticipated. The Luftwaffe pressed its advantage, not through brute force, but through adaptation. And this realization opens the next set of angles where tactics, leadership decisions, and moral costs collide. Speeds, angles, timing, and distance mattered more than raw firepower. Head-on attacks became the defining tactic. Closing at combined speeds so high that engagement windows lasted only a few seconds. The attacking fighter spent minimal time under fire, while the bomber absorbed concentrated cannon bursts aimed at cockpit, engines, or wing routes. One group forced gunners to open fire and reveal positions. Another followed seconds later from a different angle. Ammunition dwindled. Fatigue set in. Formations tightened further, paradoxically, making bombers more predictable. What American doctrine had framed as mutual protection began, under pressure, to resemble mutual confinement. The theory behind daylight bombing was deeply embedded in training, budgets, and institutional identity. Leadership framed losses as temporary necessary sacrifices before the enemy's defenses would weaken. Industrial targets were still being hit. Production figures showed damage. Veteran German pilots, fighting closer to home, accumulated experience, mission after mission. The gap widened quietly but steadily. In the skies over Europe, that cost was paid almost entirely by young men who had little influence over doctrine or strategy. Crews understood the risk long before policy shifted. They saw formations thinning. They counted missions not by dates, but by survival. There was no mutiny, no refusal. There was only but inside squadrons, every empty chair at breakfast carried weight. The moral burden of learning through attrition weighed heavily. The sky had exposed its limits. That answer would come not gradually, but violently at a turning point where confidence finally collided with undeniable loss. What had once been described in abstract terms, the targets were no longer peripheral rail yards or coastal facilities. They were aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, radar tracking, refined interception timing. Fighters climbed early, waiting at altitude, instead of scrambling late. They entered airspace that had already been measured, rehearsed, and prepared. The sky filled with movement. Fighters attacked in coordinated groups, striking from ahead and above, breaking off, reforming, and returning again. Pilots fought damaged controls to stay in position. Bombardiers held aircraft steady through flak bursts because breaking formation meant risking everyone else. Others never returned at all. What made this moment different was not just scale but clarity. The enemy was not weakening. German fighters were not deterred. They were improving. Reports from returning crews carried a consistent message. Formation flying delayed destruction but could not prevent it, and abandoning daylight bombing entirely was unthinkable. To stop now would be to concede that the central premise of American air power had failed, one that forced command to confront a reality the crews had already learned firsthand. The turning point was approaching not in theory, but in law. The reckoning arrived in the form of missions that could no longer be explained away. Deep penetrations into Germany produced loss figures so severe that even optimistic projections collapsed under their weight. Entire formations were mauled before reaching their targets. Others were shattered on the return flight, when damaged aircraft fell behind and were picked apart one by one. What had once been described as risk now became inevitability. On these missions, the sky behaved like a closed system. Fighters struck, disengaged, rearmed, and returned. Fuel limitations no longer restrained them. They were fighting over their own territory. Bombers, meanwhile, could not accelerate, could not scatter, and could not escape upward or downward without abandoning the mission entirely. The mathematical balance finally broke. Aircrews reached a point where courage alone could not bridge the gap between expectation and outcome. Veteran pilotsmen who had survived dozens of missions were lost alongside newly arrived crews still learning how to hold formation under fire. Experience no longer guaranteed survival. Commanders began to confront what crews had known for months. Attrition was outpacing replacement. Aircraft production could surge, but trained crews could not be manufactured at the same speed. The system was consuming itself. Briefings grew tense. Adjustments were discussed quietly. Tenor-Hentley, the bomber, could still strike but not alone, not without control of the air around it. The realization carried profound implications. If the bombers could not defend themselves, then the doctrine that placed them at the center of victory was incomplete. Precision bombing still mattered. Industrial targets still mattered. But survival required a new assumption, one that American air planners had resisted from the beginning. The sky itself had to be conquered. This was the moment when escort fighters ceased to be a supporting element and became a strategic necessity. Range, endurance, and sustained presence over enemy territory were no longer technical challenges, they were existential requirements. The turning point was not marked by a single announcement or order. It emerged from loss, reports stacked too high to ignore, from mission summaries that read less like progress and more like a counting of the dead, from the unmistakable conclusion that the enemy was not reacting to pressure but thriving under it. The American Air War did not end here. But it changed. What followed was adaptation born of necessity, not preference, a transformation shaped by lessons written into the sky in contrails, smoke, and falling metal. And when the bombers climbed again, they would not do so alone. The immediate aftermath was not triumph, but reckoning. Losses were tallied with a level of scrutiny previously avoided. Aircraft destroyed, crews missing, missions aborted, targets only partially damaged. The numbers forced a reassessment, not of courage or commitment, but of sustainability. Strategic bombing had not failed, but it had reached the edge of what it could accomplish under existing conditions. Commanders paused certain deep penetration raids, not as an admission of defeat, but as an acknowledgement of physics and attrition. Crews were rotated, training schedules were revised, aircraft were modified with improved armament and armor where possible. Yet these measures address symptoms, not cause. The core problem remained unchanged. Bombers operating deep over enemy territory, without continuous protection, were bleeding at a rate no industrial base could offset indefinitely. German defenses, by contrast, showed resilient. Fighter units absorbed losses and adjusted tactics without losing operational coherence. Fighting near home bases allowed pilots to fly more missions with less fatigue. Downed airmen were often recovered. Aircraft that limped home could be repaired and returned to service. This asymmetry mattered. American losses were final. Aircraft that fell over Germany were gone. Crews captured or killed could not return. Each loss represented months of training erased in seconds. The psychological effect was equally significant. Morale remained outwardly steady, but confidence shifted. Crews no longer spoke casually about invulnerability. Briefings acknowledged danger explicitly. Survival was no longer framed as an expectation but as an achievement. Strategists faced an uncomfortable truth. Destroying the enemy's industry required first surviving the journey to it. The response began quietly, almost reluctantly. Research accelerated into extending fighter range. Drop tanks, engine efficiency, and operational endurance moved from engineering curiosities to strategic priorities. Fighter squadrons were re-evaluated not by agility alone, but by how long they could remain with the bombers. This shift marked a fundamental change in thinking. The bomber was no longer the lone instrument of victory. It was part of a system, one that required layered protection, coordination, and control of airspace from departure to return. And as this new approach began to take shape, the balance in the sky started to move, not dramatically at first, but perceptibly. The air war entered a new phase, defined less by faith in theory and more by respect for the enemy and the environment in which both sides fought. That evolution would reshape everything that followed. As the months passed, the consequences of adaptation became visible in the air. Escort fighters began to stay longer. Then farther, then all the way to the target and back. What had once been a narrow protective bubble near the coast expanded into a moving shield that followed the bomber stream deep into hostile territory. This shift altered the rhythm of the air war almost immediately. German fighters now faced a choice they had not confronted before: engage the bombers and risk interception by escorting fighters, or engage the escorts and allow bombers to pass with less interference. Either decision diluted the concentrated attacks that had once devastated formations. The sky, once dominated by interception, became contested. Losses did not disappear, but their nature changed. Bombers were no longer struck repeatedly without consequence. Fighters could no longer attack, disengage, and return at will. Air combat became continuous, exhausting, and increasingly costly for the defender. Experience, once a German advantage, began to erode. Escort fighters forced German pilots into frequent engagements that shortened careers. Fuel constraints returned as a limiting factor. Training pipelines struggled to replace veterans lost over their own territory. The balance of attrition, once sharply asymmetric, began to flatten untented. Strategically, the impact was profound. Bombing accuracy improved as crews survived longer and accumulated experience. Targets were hit repeatedly rather than intermittently. Repair cycles lagged behind destruction. Factories dispersed, slowed, or relocated under pressure that could now be sustained. Equally important was the psychological shift. American crews began to believe, cautiously, that survival was possible again. Confidence did not return as bravado but as steadiness. Missions were still dangerous, but no longer felt like deliberate exposure to inevitability. For German defenders, the sky no longer offered certainty. What had once been controlled airspace became a battlefield of constant threat. Every climb carried the risk of interception. Every engagement risked not just damage, but loss of irreplaceable experience. The air war had transformed, not because technology alone advanced, but because doctrine finally aligned with reality. The lesson paid for in blood reshaped strategy into something sustainable, coordinated, and ultimately decisive. And with that transformation complete, the meaning of those early losses could finally be understood not as failure, but as the cost of learning what the sky demanded. The lesson was never about arrogance alone. It was about belief, about how deeply humans trust systems once they are written into doctrine. American planners did not misunderstand courage, they misunderstood the sky. They believed altitude could replace control, that formations could replace dominance, that engineering could compensate for time, experience, and an enemy who was watching just as closely. For a while, those beliefs seemed reasonable. The bombers flew, the targets burned, progress appeared measurable. But the sky does not reward assumptions. It compresses distance. It magnifies speed. It punishes hesitation and exposes patterns. In that environment, any doctrine that refuses to adapt becomes a liability, no matter how elegant it looks on paper. What changed the air war was not a single aircraft or innovation, but a shift in understanding. Victory in the air could not be achieved by striking alone. It required presence, continuity, control from departure to return. Only when American air power accepted that truth did the balance begin to turn decisively. The cost of learning it was immense. Thousands of airmen paid with their lives long before strategy caught up with reality. Their losses were not the result of weakness, but of a system discovering its limits under fire. Each mission flown before adaptation carried the weight of a future lesson, one that would spare others later in the war. In the end, the sky did not become safer. It became understood, and that understanding earned, through cold air, torn metal, and human endurance, reshaped not just a campaign, but the very way modern warfare would be fought above the clouds.